Story 1. Cancer patient with necrotic pressure ulcers infected with Staphylococcus hemolyticus. That poor lady suffered in ways that still leave me emotional nearly 20 years later. Story 2. My sister, who is a hoarder and struggles with money management, allowed her electricity and water services to be shut off due to unpaid bills. They continued to use the restrooms until the toilets overflowed and left the situation unresolved. I entered their house to help her move out, and the odor was unbearable. We opened every window in the house, but the smell still permeated outside. They kept the restroom doors closed, but just walking past them was so overwhelming that I had to run by to avoid feeling suffocated. Story 3. A portable toilet at a music festival after a weekend of questionable food choices was a biohazard zone. Story 4. My mom is a chef and was bringing something home when she had to slam the brakes, spilling a quart of cream. Despite extensive cleaning, the smell remained awful, and they kept that car until it died. There are many fantastic memories associated with that car and my family, but the smell was terrible. Story 5. Part of my job involves cleaning homeless encampments after they have been evacuated. I will leave it to your imagination. Story 6. A beached blue whale after about 7 days in the hot summer sun. At that time, my dog found an egg that one of my hens laid somewhere in the yard. It must have been in the sun for months. Then my dog brought it to me on the bed and popped it. We had to evacuate the house for 2 days even after cleaning it up. Story 7. I am in medicine, and I once cared for a patient who was immobile and unable to shower for several months. The condition of their tissue was deteriorating, and I worked diligently to remain composed while interviewing them. Story 8. I am almost certain it was a dead body. I walked by an old abandoned building, and it had the worst smell ever. Story 9. Working at a plasma donation company, there was a closet next to the back door where we would place the bags of used apheresis equipment. These bags would be carried out in bins when the pace slowed down. The smell of rotting blood is absolutely ghastly. There is nothing else like it. Story 10. A half-mile of freeway in New Jersey, there was a drug company manufacturing plant that smelled like mold, possibly penicillin. The scent was so overwhelming that I had to take the next exit to catch my breath. You can't keep the windows up on a motorcycle. Story 11. A bucket of dead pigeons I once encountered on a walk. The smell lingered in my nostrils for days afterward. Story 12. One day, my dad accidentally dropped a piece of vacuum-packed salmon underneath the freezer in our garage. This time bomb lasted from what I assume was October to July before its eventual explosion. I wasn't even living there anymore when it happened. I was house-sitting while my parents were away because I didn't want to be stuck in the city on the 4th of July weekend. I had to work that weekend, so I was unable to go away with friends or family. I remember walking to the garage on a swelteringly hot late afternoon. I thought I smelled something but dismissed it as something in the distance rather than something lurking on the other side of the garage door. I opened the garage only to be hit in the face by the most putrid smell my nostrils had ever encountered. Let it be known that I am a professional first responder and have dealt with many unpleasant odors before. However, nothing has come even remotely close to what happened that day. I endured hours on the scene with all kinds of rotting flesh because I kept telling myself it wasn't as bad as summer salmon. I could not even think about anything related to salmon for just over 2 years after that incident. Please keep in mind, there are only 2 smells that make my spine crawl: summer salmon and bleach. So you can imagine my displeasure as I tried to clean my parents' garage floor of something that wasn't even my fault to begin with. I was in my early 30s in my childhood home, crying from the smells like a spoiled child who didn't want to do their chores. The worst part was when I confronted my dad about it. He denied it and gaslighted me. Wasn't me, why would I do that? If I had done that, I would have taken care of it then. Ever since that day, every smell gets compared to summer salmon. Story 13. This comes with a tragic story. Our neighbors were older individuals. One man was wheelchair-bound, and there was a woman. They also had 2 small dogs. As time passed, we started seeing them less frequently. From what I could see from the hallway whenever we walked past, they were extreme hoarders. It was not unusual for them to leave all their deliveries outside for days at a time. One month, we noticed that the accumulation was more than usual. It was concerning, but it had been a snowballing theme with them, so I didn't pay it too much attention. One day, while walking my dog, I passed one of their bedroom windows and heard muffled yelling. After attempting to communicate, my girlfriend and I clearly heard the man yelling for help. We called the police. They arrived and were forced to break the door down. The moment the door opened, we were met with a putrid, disgusting smell that still makes my eyes water just thinking about it. Flies were everywhere, thousands of them. It was completely dark inside, and when the officers shone a flashlight through the doorway, all you could see was dog feces everywhere, along with everything they had hoarded stacked to the ceiling. Their door was directly across from mine, and from that door was a hallway that extended through the entire apartment to the back bedroom where we originally heard the man. As the flashlight moved towards the end of the hallway, we saw the woman sitting in a wheelchair between the hallway and the doorway to the bedroom, very much deceased. I had never seen her in a wheelchair, but we found out over time that her health had deteriorated, and she could no longer walk or walk the dogs. She was blocking the man in the room, and he couldn't get out. Apparently, he had been sitting there for about 4 days amid the mess of feces. His, hers, and the dogs. It was everywhere. I will never forget how she looked. I am a huge fan of horror games and have played hundreds of them. The way she was positioned in that wheelchair makes me feel as though she could live on as an antagonist in the most traumatizing horror experience ever. It was horrible. Story 14. My friend emptied an entire flask of urea into the sink while we were cleaning the school laboratory. The entire area surrounding the laboratory smelled like rotten eggs. The odor lingered and the wind spread it everywhere. It was not the worst smell, but I definitely remember it vividly. Story 15. An open-pit toilet in Central America, located in a small village in the mountains. I was warned by the locals that it smelled bad. I was not prepared for how bad it actually was. There had to be more than just waste decaying in there. A cloud of flies surrounded it, and the smell was truly overwhelming, making me gag. Story 16. I went to a house where the woman living there had trash everywhere and human waste all over the floor. They were living in their own filth. My partner turned and vomited immediately on the street, and I had to tell them we wouldn't be entering. They were on their own. I then tried not to vomit before getting back into the truck. Story 17. A Turkish leather processing plant has skins hanging outside to dry, with birds picking at pieces of meat. Everyone is smoking to mask the smell, but this only worsens the air quality, especially during summer. I visited in winter with snow on the ground, and it was unbearable. Story 18. A person died on the tracks at Hammersmith Station. I was about 2 minutes from walking into the station, and I could smell it in the street, something resembling a really wrong barbecue. Story 19. Patient with invasive, fungating cervical cancer. Associated with a patient who had invasive, fungating throat cancer. Story 20. I had a brief moment when I was a nurse. There was an unconscious patient, and we needed to help him use the restroom. Once the enema was administered, we waited a few minutes, and then it was time to clean. So far, it was the worst smell I had ever encountered, and I instinctively ran away. Story 21. My mom spilled a whole slow cooker full of beans in our family car on the way to a barbecue. No amount of cleaning helped. A car full of spoiled beans in 100-degree summer heat was pretty bad. I will never transport beans again. Story 22. I once worked a temporary job in the laundry department of a hospital. Needless to say, that smell is still with me today, 40 years later. I lasted 1 day. Story 23. I am a paramedic. I went to a call where the family requested a wellness check on someone because they had not seen or talked to them for 3 months. To provide some context, it was late August when we arrived at a trailer park. No one answered the door, so we attempted to open it, but the chain latch was engaged. The small gap that opened released the most putrid smell I have ever encountered, and I know that smell well. We called the fire department to force the door open. Upon entry, we discovered a body, nearly half melted into the couch. I could not hold my breath in the trailer any longer. We assume he had been dead in the summer heat for 3 months. I will never forget that smell. Story 24. I once thought it would be fun to pop a large bloated cow corpse that was waiting for the rendering truck. Story 25. My neighbor across the hall passed away. By the time it became apparent outside her apartment, the situation inside had been unresolved for some time. I was leaving for work when her body was being carried out, and with the door open, the smell was quite overwhelming. Story 26. Gastrointestinal bleed. I worked in an intensive care unit and could smell a gastrointestinal bleed patient as I stepped off the elevator. It didn't matter if the patient was in the first room or the last. It would permeate the entire unit. Story 27. I was in a shared house a few years ago, and one of the guys living there was using so many drugs that his legs started to deteriorate. Every time I walked past him, all I could smell was rotting flesh. Story 28. I spent a night in New Jersey before. It made a durian farm smell like a field of wildflowers. Story 29. I worked on a turkey farm. We had a heat wave that killed thousands of turkeys. I had to use a pitchfork to load the dead turkeys into a truck. However, that wasn't the worst smell. The worst smell occurred a day later when I unloaded the dead turkeys from the truck after it broke down 5 miles from the farm and had to load the semi-liquid turkeys into another truck during the heat wave. Story 30. Where I used to work, they had a massive sludge tank to catch all the food debris from the machinery being washed. It alone didn't stink much, but when they emptied it and washed it with chemicals, it reeked like rotten fish and burned plastic. You could taste it. I used to try to get the day off when they were doing it, or I would be walking around retching all day. Also, they used to shrink wrap things in the 1980s with a plastic that produced a nauseating smell when opened. I remember one Christmas, opening a skateboard and nearly throwing up from the smell of the plastic wrap. Story 31. I was on the train when a man with a rotten leg entered the carriage in his wheelchair. The smell was terrible. I felt nauseous and had to fight the urge to throw up. Story 32. I found a rotten egg in a crawl space last year. It had been there long enough to become foul, but the inside was still mostly liquid. Story 33. I found a sheep carcass next to the footpath during a summer hike. I could smell it before I could see it. Story 34. A friend of mine passed gas so intensely that it permeated 2 floors of a cabin we were in. The solution was to open all the windows. It was in the Alps in February at night. Story 35. I went to work with my former stepfather, who was a plumber, and a lady had been complaining that her pipes were clogged and she couldn't understand why. It turned out she had been pouring grease down the sink drain, and not just a little. I would say that a combination of raw sewage and old, coagulated grease is absolutely the worst smell I have ever encountered. As soon as we cracked the pipe, it felt like that smell had physical mass. It was horrific. As a bonus, I did some work at a dog food plant. I can't really describe the smell, but it is powerful and quite unpleasant. It lingers for a couple of days if you spend too much time in there. Story 36. Cattle feedlot on Interstate 5 in California. I drove past it in the 1980s, and it is still memorable. It seemingly went on for miles. I just looked it up. Exit 337 for Kerman. Story 37. One time, I left a decomposing water snail in a jar full of water, in direct sunlight during summer, for several weeks. I will never forget how bad it smelled. It was like getting punched in the face and up the nose by a million different scent particles. The stench was so overwhelmingly strong and awful that I felt it throughout my skull. I can't think about it any longer because I might genuinely throw up. I lost track of what I was typing, genuinely on the verge of vomiting. Story 38. Discarded materials from an asbestos roof were pressure washed and left fermenting in barrels in the sun for a month because we forgot about them. The mixture included blended moss, bird droppings, and various debris found on the roof. The stench is unbearable. I haven't encountered anything worse, including rotten eggs or decaying animal carcasses. The only thing that came close was a bag of rotting crustacean shells left behind by a neighbor who went on vacation, which had a harsh smell, but it was a very different kind of odor compared to the fermented roof materials. Story 39. Death has a distinct smell that is cold and dampens all of your senses in a state of mild disgust. I would recognize that smell anywhere. It is unpleasant but not overpowering. It is simply thick in a way that makes you want to get away from it. I have experienced it a few times, and it is hard to forget. Story 40. Palmolive soap made me gag. The scent lingered in my nose for at least 5 days. What kind of chemicals are mixed in that? Story 41. A hoarder's house in Florida, where the resident had passed away inside. The smell was noticeable from the driveway. Story 42. The dump I took at the 24-hour fitness approximately 3 months ago made the guy who sat down in the stall next to mine gag very loudly. He really heaved. Story 43. I used to work in recycling, and week-old uncleaned milk jugs and moldy industrial-sized cans of beans smell terrible. We once received a full jug, and when I picked it up, it exploded all over me. They did not let me go home to shower. Story 44. The smell of death came from my cat after he was hit by a car and dragged himself home. He lived but had to lose an eye, and his jaw was injured. Story 45. I broke my hand, and my arm was in a cast. It was only 2 to 3 weeks, but when they cut the cast off, they said that if I didn't move my fingers, there could be a lot of tendon and muscle issues. It was better to remove the cast after the bones knit a bit, even if they weren't fully healed. The stench was overpowering. It was so disgusting, 3-week-old sweat, dead skin cells, and more. It was truly unappealing. Story 46. A dead animal. I was not completely sure what it was, but I could smell it. The stench of a rotting corpse is beyond words. Story 47. Honest question here. As animals, aren't we essentially programmed to consider the smell of anything rotting to be extremely offensive? This could serve as an evolutionary defense mechanism, like a warning that something is dangerous. For example, that stinks, don't eat that, and something died here. There must be danger nearby, leave. So, should anything rotting be considered the most disgusting smell for humans and other animals? Story 48. Here's an unusual experience, depending on your definition of worse. I did some plumbing with polyvinyl chloride pipes for an aquarium, not my house, and it's necessary to apply primer on the pipes before using cement to bond them. After accidentally inhaling some of the primer, the smell wasn't unbearable, but almost immediately, I felt a burning sensation in my lungs. In terms of unpleasant smells, the one that caused my lungs to burn was quite bad. Story 49. My girlfriend passed gas in Walmart one time. She kept telling me to keep walking. I had no idea why she was saying this. Then, all of a sudden, it hit me. I could almost feel my nose hairs tingling. Story 50. Toxic mold in my old apartment's air conditioning system. It smelled like raw sewage and rotten chicken when the mold was fruiting. Story 51. I don't know how it happened, but the flies made a nest in the fruit bowl. Maggots were everywhere. The fly waste soaked into the wooden bowl, and we had to throw everything away. I look at the bowl and still remember how bad it smelled. Story 52. When I worked at a bakery, one of the recipe binders got raw egg on one of the pages, was closed, and then was not touched for a while. That corner of the bakery smelled incredibly foul until we figured out where the odor was coming from. Story 53. First responder. A large fish tank filled with 2 to 3 foot long fish in an abandoned apartment for a south-facing unit during a summer heat wave for several weeks. I kicked in the door because it smelled like a dead body from the end of the hallway. I couldn't find a body inside and then looked at the opaque brown fish tank. I saw the floaters. It honestly smelled worse than dead humans. Story 54. I have been fortunate not to encounter the smell of a dead human body, but some of the most unpleasant odors I have experienced include a dead possum left in the sun for 3 days, decomposing broccoli left in the microwave, and pig feces. I am also not fond of chicken feces. On a different note, I lost a poutine, which consists of fries, gravy, and cheese, in my truck for a couple of weeks and did not smell anything. I found it while searching for my keys. Story 55. My dog drank too much watermelon one night. The next day, he vomited all over himself and our other dog in their crates and just sat in it for who knows how long before I got home. The floor, the walls, everything was covered, and the whole basement smelled. Story 56. Little has a special on herring, and the smell permeated the entire store. It resembled the odor of numerous tonsil stones condensed into one. I had to avoid that section of the store while it was available. It was absolutely vile, worse than my cat's most unpleasant messes. Story 57. Working security at a hospital in the Catskills, I had to witness all autopsies, and authorities found a body in the water. According to the pathologist, it had been floating for at least 3 days, so she offered me a small jar of vapor rub after applying some to herself and insisting I do the same. I'm not a big fan of vapor rub, so I wasn't as generous as she was. That was a big mistake. As soon as the scalpel touched the skin of the victim, the room instantly filled with the smell of rotten chitlins with mustard and vinegar covered in powdered Parmesan. I will never forget that smell. Story 58. There was a dead rat behind a bush when I was a kid. It must have been there for a while, as the smell was very intense. I can only imagine how horrendous a human body would be. Story 59. Oh, this is a difficult decision. The cancerous tumor of a customer at the restaurant where I used to work had a biopsy. It wasn't offensive in the traditional way, but it smelled like strong, microwave cheap chocolate frosting that permeated the whole building. I'll never forget that smell. Rotting flesh is off-putting, pungent, and abhorrent. I do not recommend it. Fart spray was brought into the workplace, and it smells like a latrine mixed with rotting flesh. It cleared out a large area quickly and made most of us within 100 feet dry heave. A grease trap that hasn't been cleaned in 3 months is also unpleasant. If someone asks you to clean a full grease trap, leave. Story 60. An infected lump on my cat's head burst, and an excessive amount of fluid poured from it, creating a terrible odor. It was awful. He was absolutely fine afterward and was taken care of. Story 61. 2 answers for this. A dead carpet python that had consumed something else a few days prior and had been baking in the Australian sun, or the fungating tumors of a former colleague who was a mix of decomposing flesh and weeks-old pus. Story 62. A decomposing corpse. We have not seen our neighbor, an elderly woman with mental issues, for about 10 days. We recalled that she was once missing for 3 days, but the burning light in her living room was very suspicious. The authorities were called. Once they opened the door, a sweet and penetrating smell quickly escaped into our stairwell. It was quite a disgusting odor. Story 63. I helped rescue a dog that had fallen into an outhouse. Not a blue liquid portable toilet, but an old-fashioned, deep-dug structure that had been collecting waste for ages. After 40 minutes of rope fishing for a howling, panicking black Labrador, I swam in the lake for an hour afterward and didn't feel clean for days. Story 64. I worked at a landfill and 3 incidents come to mind. 1. Regularly, there were failed refrigerators taped up with rotten food inside. You could smell them from a distance. It was truly awful in ways I cannot describe. Infrequently, there were instances when recently closed and capped sections experienced a blowout due to water pressure. The remedy involved excavating, laying down geocloth, and backfilling. The stench that accompanied this was overwhelming. Once, an old travel trailer was brought in for disposal. These trailers are primarily made of plywood and fiberglass, with any metal, such as axles, being removed by an excavator. This particular trailer had been sitting for a couple of years with a full blackwater tank. When the bulldozer ran over it, the odor was so intense that 4 of us were sick instantly. The bulldozer had to be power washed afterward. The smell clung to my clothes so badly that I stripped down to my underwear on the back porch and immediately took them to the washing machine when I got home. Story 65. There is a factory near my house that occasionally emits an artificial, migraine-inducing smell. It feels like I am inhaling a microplastic substance. I am not sure if they are burning plastics or something else. Additionally, the scent of frying mushrooms fills the air. My dad enjoys frying mushrooms and eating them plain. The smell is so overwhelming that it can fill the entire house, and it has even made me feel nauseous. Story 66. I worked for a hoarder, not a pack rat, but someone with real hoarding issues. The garbage and miscellaneous clutter were 4 feet deep throughout the space. After weeks of cleaning, I finally reached the end of the front room, where a bowl of Halloween candy had sat in a warm, windowed corner for almost 14 years. The smell of rotten sugar created a sickly sweet perfume that lingered in my nose for 2 days. Story 67. I passed a man with bandaged legs at work. They were seeping and pooling at his feet while he was in an electric cart, and it smelled like what I imagine death must smell like. I do not know his condition, but I assume it was gangrene or something similar. It was overwhelming. Story 68. Working at McDonald's when I was about 15 years old, I was told to empty the grease bucket from the grill. Seemed like no big deal at the time. When I arrived at the grease dumpster and opened the lid, I was taken aback. As I poured the bucket in, I noticed the 2 inches of grease had solidified. I tilted it up, and suddenly the wall broke, causing the grill grease to flow out, rancid and overwhelming. The smell was intense: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, eggs, sausage, pancakes, maple, fish, barbecue. Everything was rancid. I struggled to hold back my stomach, barely managing by holding my breath. Story 69. Rotting moose carcass. It likely fell through the ice, drowned, and then washed up against a culvert. It rotted in the summer sun until I unknowingly drove by while working a summer job in the backwoods one year. Absolutely putrid. Story 70. I worked as a garbage collector. The strongest smell I encountered was when someone had recently killed a skunk and put it in the garbage can. The odor was so overpowering that it lingered with me for the rest of my shift, making my eyes water as if I had been cutting onions. The worst smell, however, came from a portable toilet that had been sitting in a garage for years, collecting dust. When I ran the bucket and smashed it, what looked like cola poured out, releasing an incredibly strong odor that was almost unbearable. You can handle anything as a garbage collector, you just get used to dealing with waste and insects. Story 71. Florida red tide cleanup involved boats where we literally stood on dead, rotting fish, which were lifted off the boat by forklift and placed into large bags. I had to bleach myself every day when I got home. Story 72. Florida red tide cleanup involved boats. I was literally standing on dead, rotting fish, which were lifted off the boat by a forklift and placed in large bags. I had to bleach myself every day when I got home. Story 73. Florida red tide cleanup on boats. I stood on dead, rotting fish, which were lifted off the boat by forklift and placed in large bags. I had to bleach myself every day when I got home. Story 74. Florida red tide cleanup involved working on boats, where I stood on dead, rotting fish that were lifted off by forklift and placed into large bags. I had to bleach myself every day when I got home. Story 75. Florida's red tide cleanup involved working on boats, where I stood on dead, rotting fish that were lifted off the boat by forklift into large bags. I had to bleach myself every day when I got home. Story 76. I helped my overweight, cigarette-smoking landlady bring a washing machine into the house. Somehow, my face got wedged between the wall and her armpit. It was the first time in my life I experienced dry heaving. The smell from her body is something I pray I never encounter again. Story 77. Not as bad as some experiences, but I remember traveling from Liverpool docks to Belfast as a child. The smell of the docks made me feel ill, and I spent a good hour crying. I couldn't describe the odor, but it was horrendous. Story 78. My son was sick and vomited while having diarrhea in his crib during the night. I could smell it all the way downstairs with the door closed. Story 79. On the funny side, Nilgai is incredibly delicious, but it produces the most unpleasant farts. They are so bad you'll want to leave the room, and we all know people enjoy their own smells. On the unpleasant side, entering someone's house for a remodel and discovering the decomposing remains of multiple animals is quite disturbing. It leaves you stuck in the area until the supervisor returns, making you want to abandon the job. Story 80. My townhouse neighbor was dead in his house for days, and the smell was seeping into mine. I came home to that after being away for 7 days. Story 81. A homeless person on the subway in New York City. I actually thought he was dead. That smell lingered in my nose for a long time. I don't think I will ever forget it. Story 82. I worked in a butcher shop during high school. We had a dumpster behind the building where we disposed of scraps. During the hot summer, it smelled like dead bodies. Story 83. My cats have a habit of defecating at 4 a.m. However, the smell of snake feces is quite strong as well. Smells like a dead, rotting rat. Generally, skunks and decaying animals do not bother me much. Story 84. I once helped an elderly man clean his refrigerator. I thought I was doing a kind deed. My punishment was opening a crisper drawer that contained an open container of rotten fish from over 3 years ago. Story 85. I once helped an elderly man clean his refrigerator. I thought I was doing a good deed. My punishment was opening a crisper drawer that contained an open container of rotten fish. Judging by the dates on many of the items in the refrigerator, it had not been cleaned out in years. That fish smell, though, I still remember it, and I don't know if anything can smell that bad. Story 86. One of the worst experiences was when the town was having a problem with the pipes. They couldn't figure out where the issue was, so they kept following the pipe. They ended up under the grocery store where I worked in the deli and bakery. Next to my door was a 6x6 steel panel on the floor that we all walked on. No one knew what it was because it never moved. It was sealed shut. The town came with jackhammers and opened it. The steel must have been 6 inches thick. They broke open the pipe below, and sewage filled the hole, coming over the sides. We had to close for a week. Story 87. I do plumbing, so I have encountered many various repulsive smells, but the smell of a dead human is the worst. It was like someone had left a pallet of dog food out in 100-degree heat for a month. It gave me an instant headache and made my eyes water. Story 88. My husband experiences gas after eating spicy shrimp from our local Mexican restaurant or shrimp Alfredo. He seems to tolerate other shrimp without any issues, but the gas from those two dishes is strong enough to wake me from a deep sleep. I often have to light multiple matches to clear the room. Story 89. Chicken liver juice in a hot car. We used chicken liver for fishing bait, and it spilled on the floorboard of the car, but we didn't notice until we went to get in the car at 1 p.m. the next day. I vomited immediately upon opening the door. Story 90. I worked in a hospital for 15 years. There are many unpleasant odors in a hospital. If I had to choose one, it would be rectal bleeding. Fresh blood mixed with feces is indescribably horrible. Story 91. That substance gets in your clothes, and when you breathe it in, you want to burn your clothes and wash your body thoroughly. It has a lingering odor from the trauma. Story 92. I used to work in an orthopedic surgeon's office. Patient came in with severe gangrene. It is the worst smell I have ever encountered. After she left, we had to close for the day and the next day to have the place fumigated. Story 93. Multiple decomposing humans at the medical examiner's office were in body bags in the refrigerated rooms. When the door opened, it was overwhelming. Story 94. My boyfriend's lingering unpleasant farts after consuming almond milk are worse than those from regular milk due to his lactose intolerance. I'm pretty sure he needs to stay away from all types of milk, which is unfortunate for a serial addict. Story 95. A woman neglected her husband, allowing him to deteriorate in bed. Insects were consuming his legs and groin, pupating in the waste surrounding him. The ambulance crew confirmed he had a pulse when they found him. The odor of a year of urine, feces, decay, and an unwashed body clung to him and the sheets, creating an overpowering stench. Story 96. Helping my sister move. Her boyfriend had left a garbage bin in the backyard from a party a few months earlier. It was full of food scraps, rubbish, and water. He insisted on keeping the $6 garbage bin. I tried to empty it into my trailer, and it exploded, releasing maggots, food, and bin juice. We were gagging, and I vomited a bit. I took it to the dump, where they usually sift through for recycling, and the attendant advised me not to go inside. I took the trailer to the car wash 3 times to get rid of the smell. It was putrid. Story 97. A man died in his car during a Texas summer, where the air conditioning was malfunctioning. He was in the car for over 24 hours, and the temperature reached 180 degrees Fahrenheit. His body was already decomposing, and he went into ketosis. Story 98. Driving by a chicken farm, I'll never forget that smell. I don't eat chicken, and that's why they call it foul, tied with the smell of a deceased human in the park. Story 99. An industrial facility that collects and processes all the contents of red cabinets in doctors' offices, specifically biohazards, smelled like burning blood and plastics. Story 100. We had a client receiving cleaning services through the Department of Aging, and his apartment had an unbearable odor that could be detected from the parking lot. He was an alcoholic and kept his apartment at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Even in the summer, we would turn it down to a reasonable temperature upon arrival, but he always cranked it back up. He was incontinent, though it was unclear if this was due to physical issues or his addiction. The carpeting in his apartment absorbed all his mess, which then worsened the smell. I used to double mask and chew the strongest cinnamon gum I could find when I entered. I have encountered some unpleasant-smelling homes, but nothing that compelled me to vomit or that I couldn't improve, except for this situation. I am fairly certain he has passed away. I would expect they had to completely renovate that apartment down to the studs, and probably the units next to it as well if that was the case. Story 101. After my house was flooded, the waters receded, leaving dead cattle and horses everywhere because the levee broke before farmers could move their livestock. The smell of decay in the July heat was absolutely overwhelming. A brief mention of the time I worked in a poultry processing plant serves as another shock to the senses. Story 102. I hadn't seen my dad in years. I received a call from his girlfriend, informing me that he was in the hospital and likely losing his foot. When I arrived, his foot was completely bandaged. The doctor explained that it was a cut that never healed and was now too severe. She asked if I wanted to see it, and I was horrified and declined. However, the smell will stay with me forever. Story 103. It's a toss-up. Either a week-old dead donkey in Iran or a piece of minke whale that washed up on the beach in San Francisco. I think the whale actually smelled worse, although the donkey smelled stronger, if that makes any sense. Story 104. Fungating breast cancer. I could smell it through my respirator from outside the house. She was very much alive too. Story 105. Denver has a Purina dog food factory. After that, there is rotten cooked spinach, 2-week-old sour milk, and rotten potatoes. Story 106. The smell of rotting human blood filled the air. My mother had been bleeding internally for days without realizing it. She thought she had the flu. Blood started pouring from her mouth while she was sitting on the toilet, and the entire bathroom was covered in over an inch of blood. I screamed at my dad to call emergency services, and we followed the ambulance to the hospital, which was over an hour away. By the time she was stabilized, the blood had congealed and was decomposing. I had to clean it up, and I nearly threw up repeatedly. Story 107. My next-door neighbor had been deceased in his home without air conditioning for 8 to 10 days when they opened the garage door. I will never forget that smell. Story 108. Pulling week-old dead bodies from a well in a small village in Somalia occurred 32 years ago and still resurfaces from time to time. Story 109. I was helping an elderly neighbor clean up his cluttered backyard. There was a 4-inch PVC pipe leaning against a tree, with the bottom settled an inch or so into the ground. I went to grab it and realized it was full of water. I wiggled it free and lifted it off the ground, and all the liquid gushed out from the bottom, along with what appeared to be a mostly hairless squirrel or rat carcass in a gelatinous sack that broke open upon hitting the ground. The smell was the most concentrated, pungent, vinegary, pine-like odor that I can still recall. Another time, I visited a junkyard looking for parts for my Chevrolet S10 pickup and found one that had been in a terrible wreck. The driver's seat was crusted over with what looked like bloody oatmeal, and the headrest had hair matted to it. I can't remember actually smelling anything, but the memory is enough to make me gag even now. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.